By its very nature, the life of a private eye is shrouded in secrecy. Most of us picture a trench coat wearing Dick Tracy type. But the new book, My Family Business, Memoirs of a Boston Private Eye, shines a light on the undercover industry. Author John DiNatale began his career as an apprentice to his private investigator father. He's now the senior partner at DiNatale Detective Agency. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you for having me.
So I love the opening of this book where you credit your father with teaching you how to drive a car and tail somebody at the same time. So I want to know, what's the secret to tailing somebody?
Staying out of their sight, at least for usually the first half hour. And then after that, once people settle in, then they just kind of feel comfortable. Then, as my dad used to say, especially when we first started doing this, me back in the late 60s, early 70s, we did a lot of husband and wife surveillances back then. And it was a big part of a private investigator's job. And my dad would say, if you can stay out of their sight for the first 5-10 minutes, he said, once they're together, then you can throw a rope around the bumper of their car and they'll just drag you along because they won't be looking for you.
So did you ever get made?
Oh, sure, absolutely. You know, not very often, but, you know, that's just a fact of life. You get made. There's no question about it. You can't make a car disappear in the middle of a street. You know, sometimes someone's looking, and if they're looking, it's really difficult to avoid them. But we're pretty good at it. So
your father was really, really instrumental in the investigation into the Boston Strangler murders, the Albert DeSalvo case. And, of course, I was fascinated reading those sections in the book. And you describe one part in the book, you describe it as saying, here's an expert, it says, anyone who was alive then, but especially women who lived alone and children old enough to listen to the news, will remember the fear that buzzed in the air every time a new victim was discovered. There were 13 women, I think it was, over 4 years. And I was a kid in New York at the time, and I can remember following it from afar, but your dad was in the thick of it.
Oh, absolutely. You know, not only him, but, you know, the other investigators that he worked with, and they were all part of the Boston Strangler Task Force. And this was a group of really dedicated detectives that worked night and day for years. And back then, there was no overtime. I mean, if you worked more than 8 hours a day, you just did it because they were under a great deal of pressure. I mean, every time another body came up, I can remember my dad coming home and being so frustrated, but yet so dedicated. And that was a time of his life where everything focused around the Strangler case. And without the Boston Strangler case, there would have been no DiNatale Detective Agency. You know, after the Strangler case broke and my dad got involved in the initial movie back in 1968, he came back and didn't have a job. And so he did what he did best, and he started our detective agency, and I was 16. My younger brother, who's my partner in the business, was obviously just in grade school, but as he grew up, he did the same thing. And my dad, in our very first surveillance case, dragged me out with him one night when I was 16 and said, come on, let's go. And
like
this was my introduction. Yes, exactly. And I wasn't quite dressed for it, but that was something that just captured me. And even though I went to college and graduate school and actually got my master's degree in 20th century Russian history, it kept calling me back and calling me back. And, you know, it was funny, as I say in the book, my dad never asked my brother or I to join him in the business. It just kind of happened.
All right, so your father actually, after DeSalvo was convicted, communicated with him, or Albert DeSalvo, I guess, wrote to him. And here's one of the letters in his handwriting, which is just incredible. It was a little bit hard to read, but, you know, he was quite well-spoken. Here's a little bit of an excerpt of that letter.
Well, you know, the interesting thing about that letter, and one of the reasons I pulled it out, was the date on it. It's June 14th, 1962. And I'm sorry, June 14th, 1962 was the date of the first murder of Anna Slessors. And so when he wrote the date, January 14th, 1967, he said, Phil, it hit me when I wrote this date. So he knew, some 5 years later, writing that letter to my dad, that this was the anniversary of the first killing.
Let me see. There's a little excerpt that I just want to pull up. I'm sorry about your boy not being well. Keep your chin up. He'll be okay. Was he talking about you?
Talking about me.
What was wrong with you?
Oh, at the time, I think I'd fallen and broken my shoulder and my collarbone, and so, you know, I was in the hospital for a few days, but, you know, I was fine. But Albert was, Albert was a real family man. I mean, there's a lot about him that people really don't understand, and it's one of the reasons, like, my dad became, they became pen pals and communicated with each other for several years while he was in prison.
Your dad got very frustrated over the fact that there were so many deniers, people who didn't believe that Albert DeSalvo was really the Boston Strangler, and he said, you know, it's amazing, you know, put him in jail and the killing stopped. But how did you feel last July when DNA evidence proved for once and for all that Albert DeSalvo was indeed the murderer of Mary Sullivan? I mean, Casey Sherman had written a whole book about that, denying that it was possible.
Well, I felt a sense of relief for my father, and I mean, I knew deep in my gut, and that's how I make my living, that Albert was the strangler, because my father thought so. And he loved to say to people, you know, somebody can say in one sentence that Albert wasn't the strangler, and I can show you files for 3 days that says he was. And so it's really one of the reasons I initially wanted to write a book about the Strangler case, because I was upset about Casey Sherman's book. I was upset about Susan Kelly's book, and my dad's been deceased since 1987. But the people that I spoke to about the book said, John, the Strangler is part of the book, but really the story is you and your brother in this family business. But that was my impetus to write the story and to get the real story about the Strangler out there, because Albert was the killer, and the people who were writing otherwise really, in my mind, weren't qualified to write that.